Good morning. Welcome to our look at Through the Bible in a Year. This morning I'm at the other office. My schedule got kind of broken up this week, and so I am over here at the Prairie Chapel office today. And I want to look at Isaiah 24. This is a marvelous passage, and it caught my attention because this week, in light of Earth Day, one of the podcasts that I listened to, BioLogos, brought on a theologian to talk about creation care and the theology of creation care. And she happened to reference some of the passages that talk about the day of the Lord. And so I was really struck this week in reading Isaiah 24 and the idea of the day of the Lord, because we so often misread these passages, and Isaiah 24 is no exception. We get focused in on the violence and the destruction that comes with the day of the Lord, and we forget what the causes are. And I like this chapter because it starts out and we see that the evil of humanity is spiraling out of control. It's just downhill, downhill, downhill. Few people are left. The world is just terrible. There's no joy. There's no merriment. There's no singing and dancing. The wine tastes like vinegar. It is terrible living conditions. And humanity has brought that on themselves. And then all of a sudden, in verse 14, there is a shift, a drastic shift away from the violence and the hatred, and suddenly the people decide that they're going to worship God. And all of a sudden, the day of the Lord breaks in. And here we see a passage where there's violence and there's an earthquake and there's the earth is thrown in upheaval. But it shouldn't be that we shouldn't be seeing that God is destroying the earth. Rather, we should see that God is removing all of the destruction of sin and remaking the earth. As I looked at that passage, as I was reading that passage, I noticed how the storyline mirrors how I tilled up the garden for the first time a couple of years ago here at our house. The garden was a hay field. It was an overgrown, it wasn't even a good hay field. It was a rather useless hay field that had as much, it wasn't even really a well-seeded hay field. And so there were a lot of weeds, and there were a lot of just unwanted plants. And I had to go through and break out that soil. And I can imagine that if you were going to describe that process from the perspective of the earthworm, you would describe it as very violent and brutal. You would describe it almost as the end of the world. But in reality, I wasn't ending it. I was remaking it. I was removing all of the years of neglect. And I was undoing what years of neglect had caused and rebuilding something much more solid. And that's the picture that we see in Isaiah. The picture we see is of God coming in and undoing all of the years of neglect that we as humanity have caused for the earth. We have had these years where we have just neglected God's creation. And eventually God is going to say enough is enough, and God is going to come in and retill the garden. And while that's going to look fairly violent to some people, it should be something we celebrate. It should be something we rejoice over. It should be a happy day for us that God is coming in to renew the garden that God wanted. So as we are thinking about, living out our lives, we should ask ourselves, do we really want a very violent picture of the earth being remade due to complete neglect? Or do we as Christians want God's job to be slightly easier, and we start restoring and renewing the earth now? I, for one, would want to see, God's job at the end of days a little bit easier. I would like to see that renewing and restoration be something that is, something that where God says to me, "Thank you for doing the best you can. Even if God has to undo what I've done, thank you for doing the best you can to maintain the garden that I gave you." And that involves a lot of care. So as you go out this week, as you're living your life, think about the idea that God's going to remake this world. God's going to remake the earth, and it is going to be something glorious. But that in the meantime, we don't want to live out the picture of the first half of Isaiah, where humanity is few in number and we are cowering in fear. Rather, we'd like to live out a really great picture of, God with us. The idea that we are living out God's ideal life. So as you go through this week, I hope you get something from Isaiah 24. I hope you see the day of the Lord as a glorious reshaping of the earth and something that you can participate in, no matter who you are. And so